So in this video lecture, we'll move on to section 2.2, painting. Now, painting is probably what comes to most people's minds when they think of art. And really, painting is one of the oldest forms of art. Paint is composed of pigment suspended in a liquid binder. That liquid binder dries after the application and allows the pigment to adhere to a surface. So pigment is color, right? Traditionally, these are extracted from minerals, soils, plants, but modern pigments can also be produced synthetically. Binders is, you can essentially think of your binder as glue. The type of binder used, so depending on the type of liquid used, it has an effect on the work's final appearance, but so does the application of the paint. So there are many types of paint, some of which have been in use for thousands of years, some of which are natural, and some of which are more modern and synthetic. Around 40,000 BCE, Neanderthals evolved into Homo sapiens, which is essentially the modern human species. And it was then that they developed the cognitive capabilities to create and recognize symbols and imagery, to interpret and assign meaning to their surroundings, and to create art. So here we're looking at one of the earliest examples of painting as a form of art. This is at the Pecmerle Cave in Dordogne, France, and it dates to about 23,000 BCE. So we have these spotted horses that were created with a pigment and saliva solution. It's believed that this was applied to the walls of the cave about 25,000 years ago by blowing the solution through a reed or tube onto the wall. So saliva was a common binder used in prehistory, but also things like animal fat would be mixed with pigments from minerals, soil, ash, charcoal, etc. The spotted horses here are pretty typical for these prehistoric cave paintings. Most of them depict animals, and these were probably made using a sort of charcoal-based pigment mixed with that saliva binder, and again, blown through a tube or reed. Not all of these prehistoric cave paintings are animals. Some of them feature human imagery as well. In fact, you can sort of see here the outlines of human hands, right? So it's as if the hand was placed against the rock as a sort of stencil, and then the pigment and saliva solution was blown over it to create this kind of negative shape, which scholars have determined that the handprints here at Pecmerle Cave, based on the finger lengths and kind of hand sizes in general, they've determined that both male and female artists were involved here. Now, it is important to keep in mind the horse imagery is a bit older than the hands, so presumably this cave or this site was a location that people returned to over a span of time. So whether the original artist of the horse was female or male, we don't know, but we do know that both men and women would have been involved in such art making. So another ancient type of painting is encaustic painting. So with encaustic, the pigment is mixed with hot wax as the binder. So typically beeswax, although more modern versions of this might use resin. So this is a mixture that must be applied rather quickly, typically using brushes, maybe palette knives or rags. Sometimes the material is poured directly onto the surface. But when it's hot and the wax is fluid, the mixture flows quite easily. But as the material cools and the wax begins to harden, it becomes quite fragile and rather unflexible. Encaustic needs a stiff-backed support, like a piece of wood, or it will crack. So if we were to apply encaustic to, say, canvas, something that is fabric, right? It's not stiff. It doesn't support itself. It would potentially cause the encaustic to crack on the canvas surface and maybe even fall off. Sometimes after an encaustic painting is completed, there is a final stage that we call burning in which a heat source is passed closely over the surface of the painting, which melts that wax just a little bit and allows the colors to sort of blend together. So again, encaustic is one of the oldest painting media. It was used in ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt. The word encaustic actually comes from the Greek word for burning in. So we're looking at an example of encaustic painting. This is what's called a Fayum mummy portrait. We call it that because it was found near the Fayum Oasis, which is about 60 miles south of Cairo in Egypt. These were made, these were made during the Roman occupation of Egypt. So not all of them come from this area, but they sort of reflect the multicultural empire that was the Roman Empire at the time. These were portrait panels that were placed over the faces of mummies. They created sort of a convincing sense of three-dimensionality, using these modeled kind of features, or rather modeling the features with these flowing brushstrokes. The consistency of the wax kind of builds up in layers and creates this very realistic kind of three-dimensional quality or texture. Encaustic is also a relatively transparent medium, so it can be built up in layers, and it allows for this sort of luminosity, a bit of surface texture, and it reflects highlights quite well. And again, with that burning in, you can create this sort of subtle blend of colors. And as you can see, this work, created in about 100 to 150 CE, is a testament to the durability of encaustic. If used correctly on the correct surface and things, it holds up remarkably well. It's really quite permanent. Here's another example. This is an icon of Christ from the St. Catherine Monastery at Mount Sinai. It was made during the 6th century. And again, this is encaustic. So here the artist has shown the sort of dual nature of Christ, both as human and as God, or as a divine being. And so that duality is really shown in the different sides of the face. On the right side, which is our left, we have the heavenly or divine side, whereas the left side of Christ's face, which is our right, is the human side. So one side is sort of idealized, where the other is worn, heavy, the hair is more disheveled, the cheek and the eyes are sort of more sunken in. The heavenly side, his hand sort of gestures in this holy blessing, where the earthly side holds a scripture. So again, you can sort of see the longevity or permanence of encaustic as a painting media. But you can also, I think, get a sense of the need to work quickly with this media, especially if you look kind of at the hands or in the drape of the robe here. You get a sense of these sort of quick brush strokes or quick applications of the wax, trying to get it onto the surface before it hardens too much. Fresco is a painting technique in which the artist applies paint onto fresh plaster. The word fresco is Italian for fresh, and so pigment is mixed with lime water and then applied to lime plaster surfaces, and that plaster then absorbs the color, and the pigment binds to the lime plaster through a sort of chemical reaction. There are two sort of types of fresco painting. One is buon fresco, B-U-O-N fresco, And so here the artist applies that pigment solution to a still wet layer of plaster. And so the wet pigment and painting literally become part of the wall. This is a very durable form of fresco. It leaves brilliant colors. This is often considered true fresco. However, you also have to work rather quickly with buon fresco. The artist can only plaster as much of the wall as can be painted before the plaster dries. So usually only what can be done or completed in a single day. Now we also have fresco secco, or dry fresco. So here the artist moistens the layer of plaster that has already set and then applies the pigment solution. So the plaster absorbs less of the color, less of the pigment, and therefore the painting is less durable and the colors are a bit more dull. Excuse me. So some of the earliest examples of this fresco method are from Crete, in the ancient Aegean region, specifically from the Palace of Knossos and other sites. So the example we're looking at is the Bull Leapers from the Palace of Knossos. This was created from about 1450 to 1375 BCE, and it displays a common activity amongst the Minoan people on the island of Crete. So the Minoans were a very athletic people, and much of their art displays activities like bull leaping or boxing or maybe acrobatic scenes, which potentially these were pleasure activities or maybe for sport, ceremony, or ritual. So in this particular composition, we have 3 young figures, 2 on either side of the bull here with lighter skin, which was, for the Minoans, lighter skin indicated that the figures were female, whereas the darker skinned individual in the center, his kind of red dark skin indicates that he is male. So we have 2 figures on either side of a bull and a 3rd figure on top of the bull, sort of, almost as if he is flipping over, whereas the left figure seems maybe like they have just landed, and the right figure seems like they are preparing to do this same sort of acrobatic leap over this creature. Maybe this is a depiction of some sort of initiation ritual or a fertility ritual, or maybe it's just fun. Maybe this was just something that Minoan youths did in their spare time. But we have this sort of abundance of energy. We have the implication of movement and activity. The bull is in this kind of stretched out pose, which we call a flying gallop pose, to sort of imply its speed and strength and power as it rushes forward here. In the 18th century, many frescoes were discovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum. So they had been buried under volcanic ash since the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. So they're actually pretty impressively preserved here. And some of these frescoes are still life paintings, which is quite interesting. It shows an it shows an interesting level of realism and kind of life-size objects depicted in these scenes that would have decorated the interiors of homes or maybe public buildings, things like that. In Renaissance Europe, frescoes were often used to decorate the interiors of churches. So here we have Masaccio's expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. This is from a set of frescoes from the interior of the Brancacci Chapel at the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, Italy. So this is an illustration of a biblical narrative, but it's also a really great figure study. He has these monumental, kind of naturalistic nude figures of Adam and Eve. The fresco itself is about 7 feet tall, so the figures are maybe 5 to 6 feet tall, so roughly life size. And so Masaccio has depicted the moment in which Adam and Eve have eaten the forbidden fruit. They have committed their sin, and they are being banished from the Garden of Eden here. So above them, we have this foreshortened angel that sort of ushers them out of the portal. Um, the portal also has these sort of rays of light which are emanating outward from it, which potentially is indicative of sort of the divinity of the garden itself, or maybe it's representative of the divine presence of God. Now, you might notice the lines of light, as well as the sword, are sort of strangely dark. These were once silver, but because silver oxidizes over time, they are now quite dark. But you can actually see the giornata here. So giornata, Giornata. This is an Italian word that means day. So in this sense, it is the amount of fresco an artist could complete in a day. So this wouldn't really have been visible at the time, but over the years, as the pigments have faded and the fresco has undergone a bit of damage, the sections are now visible to us. So you can sort of see we have kind of an outline around Adam, an outline around Eve, maybe an outline around the angel and around the portal here. So we have 4 pieces of this fresco, which is 4 days' work. So we think that Masaccio created the angel on day 1, he painted the portal on day 2, then he painted Adam on day 3, and finally Eve on day 4. So kind of an interesting example of the fresco process here. It's probably fair to say that no other painting medium requires such careful planning and such physical labor as buon fresco or true fresco does, which is the technique that Michelangelo used here at the Sistine Chapel. This took him 4 years to complete, and he came up with some very creative ways to disguise those seams between the giornata. For example, if we sort of zoom in on one area here, looking at the Libyan Sibyl, Michelangelo, he only plastered the area of the leg that would be in the foreground, and then he used sort of the changes in color and changes in value to disguise the edges of his giornata. So the result the result is a very sort of unified composition, but in actuality it's made up of several smaller sections, right? So here we have Raphael's School of Athens. This is another example of Renaissance fresco, which we've already looked at this quite a bit, but it is at the Vatican, which is right next to the Sistine Chapel. And Raphael would have been working on this at the same time that Michelangelo was working on the Sistine ceiling next door, and both using buon fresco, so using similar techniques here. Now, once buon fresco has dried, it's very hard to alter. The plaster really has to be chipped off completely and redone. So the artist typically would use a full-scale preliminary drawing that we call cartoons to prepare for their fresco. So the artist would sketch out their composition to scale and then perforate it with small pinholes, and then place the sketch on the wall, and then take soot or charcoal dust and clap it over the surface, which would sort of transfer the drawing onto the wall in the dotted form, and therefore create a guide for the artist to follow as they apply their fresco. So here's an example of a cartoon for the School of Athens. Now this one was probably not the one used to transfer the drawing onto the wall, but it does give you a good idea of kind of what that might look like. Another traditional painting medium is tempera. So tempera paint is traditionally pigment mixed with egg as the binder. Now, other things can be used, such as fat or milk emulsion, but for the purposes of this class, we'll simply say that tempera is made with egg. Now, this really works best when it's mixed fresh for each painting. Tempera is fast drying and usually applied, excuse me, with these short, quick strokes. It really lends itself to careful details, but tempera paints don't blend very well, so you can sometimes have kind of harsh lines. But they do retain their brilliant colors over a long period of time, so they are relatively durable. Now, some artists prefer egg whites, whereas many prefer egg yolks because the sort of yellow coloring adds a very soft, luminous glow to the tempera paint, which on its own dries in a matte finish. Now, the example we're looking at here is Sandro Botticelli's Primavera from 1482. This is a pretty typical Botticelli composition. We have very elongated and graceful figures, illustrating a classical mythological narrative. So at the center we have Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. She's dressed pretty modestly and framed by the sort of trees and foliage here above her. To the left we have the three Graces. These are minor goddesses, and they are kind of dancing in this circle together. And then on the other side of them, we have Mercury, the messenger of the gods, which we can identify him by his sort of winged sandals and his little helmet. And then we have on the right side Zephyr, the god of wind, who is seen abducting Chloris, who was a wood nymph who was associated with spring. And next to them, we have Flora, the goddess of spring herself, who is kind of sowing flowers as she walks through this forest. And finally, overhead, we have Cupid, or Eros, the god of love, with his bow and arrow. So the full meaning of this composition is a bit ambiguous. We're not really sure why Botticelli created this. I think there is some argument to be made that it was commissioned as maybe a excuse me, maybe a gift for a newly wedded couple or to celebrate a marriage, but we're really not sure. But we do have the idea of the celebration of love, peace, prosperity, maybe the idea of fertility or growth. But this is a really great example of how tempera lends itself to a very fine attention of detail. You can see the detail in the tassels, in the flowers and fabrics that are presented here, but you also see sort of this luminous glow in certain areas. For instance, the kind of glow of the skin of the nymphs, or this kind of sheer gauzy fabric that they're wearing. There's also a certain brilliance to the oranges, even though the pigments in the vegetation are quite dark. So kind of creating contrast here. And again, the tempera itself would dry matte, so that kind of soft, luminous glow that's added from the egg yolk really enhances the color here. Here's a more contemporary example of tempera painting. This is Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World from 1948. This is really one of his most famous paintings. And the colors here are a bit more subdued, and the subject is a little subdued as well. So we have this woman crawling through this tawny, sort of scrubby grass. This is actually the artist's neighbor in Maine, who had been crippled by polio. She was very limited physically, but Wyeth noted she was by no means limited spiritually. He explained that the challenge to me was to do justice to her extraordinary conquest of a life which most people would consider hopeless. He attempted to record the arid landscape, the rural house, and the shacks in the background with really great detail. He's sort of painting minute blades of grass with singular strokes, as well as individual strands of hair and the sort of nuances of light and shadow as they fall across the plain here. Wyeth is working in a style known as magic realism, in which everyday scenes are imbued with this sort of poetic mystery. So he's really trying to capture the scene, the setting, as well as the overwhelming difficulty that this woman had simply attempting to move through her life. And so the tempera here allows him to really mimic reality, and capture those tiny details that create such a naturalistic or realistic composition. So while oil painting is probably what most people think of when they think of painting or maybe visual art in general, it's actually a relatively recent invention, especially in comparison to encaustic, fresco, or tempera painting. So artists began using oil paints in the medieval period, but really the medium took off and spread throughout Europe in the 15th century. And so with oil painting, oil is the binder. So particularly or most commonly linseed oil, which is a byproduct of the flax plant, which is used to make linen, which was very common and a very common product in 15th century Europe. Giorgio Vasari, who was an Italian painter in the 16th century, as well as an art historian, credits the Northern Renaissance painter Jan van Eyck with the with the invention of oil painting, but that's not necessarily true, although he is probably the most impressive early user of the medium. So here we have Jan van Eyck's Man in the Red Turban. We think this is likely a self-portrait of Van Eyck here, created in 1433. And this is a really great example of the qualities of oil paint. So Van Eyck has used light and shade in a very subtle yet dramatic way here. The sitter sort of seems to emerge from the darkness. His face and headdress are modeled by the light that falls from the left. The viewer is sort of drawn towards the image by the very penetrating gaze of this sitter. Now down below we can also see it's inscribed with als ik kan, or as I, or as Ike can. Potentially this is Van Eyck's sort of signature, but it's really sort of thought by scholars that this was a way of him promoting himself as a successful artist, saying, look what I can do, look what I can create by using oil painting. So here's another work by Van Eyck. This is Madonna of Chancellor Roland. And this is a great work to use to look at the advantages of oil paint. So after you listen and look at this work, maybe flip back to Man in a Red Turban and see if you can pick out how the advantages of oil paints are at work in that composition. But oil paint is a flexible medium, whereas tempera needs a stiff-backed support. Oil paint can be applied to a cloth support, such as canvas or linen, and therefore it's a more portable work of art. It also has a certain transparency that allows the use of thin layers of color, or what we call glazes, which is how Van Eyck worked. So he creates rich luminosity as if the work is sort of lit from within, because he's using so many layers of transparent or semi-transparent colors. This allows light to sort of pass through those layers of color and reflect back, and creates the impression that the light is emanating from within the painting itself. Now, another advantage of oil paint is that linseed oil is quite slow to dry, so the artist can go back and rework the painting for several days, and they can also achieve quite high levels of detail and a smooth surface finish on the canvas. Here's another example of oil on canvas, another self-portrait, but by a different artist and a bit later. This is Rembrandt from about 1659. Rembrandt created hundreds of self-portraits over his lifetime, and he really understood the medium of oil painting and how to achieve that sort of inner luminosity or inner glow. Now, oil paint is much more versatile than tempera. It can be blended on the canvas or on the painting surface itself, and it can create excuse me, it can be used to create a sort of continuous scale of tones or hues, whereas tempera is not so readily blendable. Oil paints can also deal with subtle changes in light and achieve the most realistic 3D effects of all the painting media. Depending on the consistency, the layers can be either opaque or translucent, and oil paint can also be thinned with materials like turpentine and more oil to become more transparent. So here with Rembrandt's self-portrait, you can sort of see that luminosity appearing in the face. We have this sort of red glow in the nose, almost as if perhaps he is a little inebriated. But we also get a very kind of realistic sense of moisture in the eyes here. We have this very kind of light highlight, almost as if, again, well, as if the glow is being emanated from within the painting itself. And so he's achieved that by building up the painting with various layers of relatively transparent color. So while some artists seek to create a very smooth or untextured surface with oil paint, other artists use what's called impasto, I-M-P-A-S-T-O, or a very thick application of oil paint to create a kind of highly textured surface, which the sort of quintessential example here would be Van Gogh, which his thick application of paint really adds to the expressiveness of his works as well. Many artists also use watercolor, either as a preliminary material or in their final works. So watercolor consists of pigments suspended in a water-soluble binder, such as gum arabic or honey, and that binder helps the pigment adhere to the surface of the paper when dry. So watercolor is typically pretty transparent, and it is created, or excuse me, watercolor works are created by building up washes or layers of color. So here we have Andrew Wyeth's Frostbitten of 1962. You can sort of see how he's creating this rough texture through washes of color, and also creating a sense of depth through these sort of subtle changes in the way he's applying the watercolor to the paper. So we can also have gouache, G-O-U-A-C-H-E. Gouache is essentially watercolor, but it has a certain additive, often a sort of white chalk, and that makes it more opaque than watercolor. So here we have Albert Durer's Young Hare. This is watercolor and gouache on paper. So specifically, he's using white gouache for the highlights here, kind of creating the soft texture of the fur. Watercolor and gouache are both commonly used on paper because the fibers of the paper kind of help grab and hold those pigments into place as the liquid or the binder evaporates. And probably one of the most contemporary or modern forms of painting is acrylic painting. So acrylic consists of pigment suspended in an acrylic polymer resin. So this is a synthetic paint. It's only been around since about 1950, but it's quite popular for its versatility and its practicality. Acrylic paints are quite quick to dry. They clean up and thin pretty easily with water. You don't have to use toxic or corrosive materials like turpentine. Similar to oil paints, the binder is transparent, so the colors really maintain a high degree of intensity. And when dry, acrylics have similar characteristics to oil paints, or it can be sort of applied in a way to mimic the softer effects of watercolor. It just depends on how the artist chooses to apply the paint, or if they choose to thin it with water, things like that. With acrylics, the artist can really achieve crisp edges, as well as this sort of flat quality, and the surface texture of acrylic means that it can be drawn on top of, so it's great to combine with other other artistic materials. But if you apply acrylic too thickly, it will crack, sometimes flake off the surface. So here we're looking at Roger Shimamura's Untitled from 1984. This is a excuse me, this is an acrylic painting with a very sort of graphic novel or comic book quality about it. The artist is using very clean edges and the flat quality of acrylic paint, which lends itself very nicely to this sort of thing. We've got quite hard-edged outlines and solid spanses of colors, which the fact that acrylic dries so quickly really allows artists to place colors next to each other without the worry of them bleeding together, which is not necessarily the case for other types of paint that we've looked at so far. Here's another example. This is David Hockney's Portrait of an Artist, or Pool with Two Figures, from 1972. Hockney is one of the most well-known artists for working exclusively with acrylic paints. And so again, you can see those very clean lines, kind of that flat quality to the surface. But we also have this softer sort of blending as well, almost mimicking watercolor here perhaps. Really sort of a graphic minimalist approach to his paintings.